I want to ask you again, put your hands together and thank Mark for doing that this morning. Awesome, awesome job. I don't think it was all that bad. I mean, the water's really, really warm, so he had a great time. And great to be here together. I want to take a moment, too, and welcome those of you who are joining us at Church Online, Church at Home. If you're just tuning in, we just experienced a baptism here in our room, and just quite a celebration. But I wanted to also just kind of say hello to those of you who are joining us today, maybe supporting Mark and being here for the first time. We've been in a series called Own the Vision, and we've been looking at the life and story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, if you've never read this book in your Bible, it's one of the great historical accounts of someone following God's vision. And it gets kind of crazy, it's very challenging, but this is the vision that God has given to Nehemiah, to go and to do something really crazy, rebuild an entire wall around the great city of Jerusalem. And we're going to see how he continues to do that. But today, the topic is to see how Nehemiah deals with criticism and discouragement. Now, that might seem like kind of a strange transition. We just had all this celebration about Mark, and now we're going to talk about criticism and discouragement. Well, actually, I was thinking this is often how life works. We have these moments that seem to be sort of like mountaintop experiences. We're like flying high and everything is going extremely well, kind of like for Mark, this step of being baptized. And then often what happens is after sort of these mountaintops, whether they're spiritual or just phases of your life, you then have this inevitable experience of kind of a valley, right? You have mountaintops and valleys. And I've learned over the years that people spend a lot of time getting ready for their mountaintop experiences, right? They prepare for, they look forward to, and if you don't believe me, just go on social media, right? I mean, most everything that gets posted is someone's, highlight in their life, some sort of mountaintop experience. But what we don't do very well is we don't prepare for those inevitable lows, and especially maybe those seasons that feel a little bit more discouraging or a little bit more like you're just kind of getting criticized from all different angles. Let me just kind of set the stage this way. Let me ask you kind of this question. Are you feeling discouraged at all? I mean, it's only a couple months into the new year, but have you already kind of found it? Like there's already like one thing, or there's maybe a handful of things, and you're already feeling a little bit discouraged. Like 2021 isn't what you had hoped for just yet. Or maybe another way to think about it, how many of you would be honest in saying that you have at least one person that's sort of critical of you? You know that person, right? I mean, they nitpick, they constantly are chirping at you. You can never do anything right. You're always kind of the source of their attacks, and they're just critical, constantly dogging you. Let me just see, show of hands. How many of you have at least one critic in your life? How many of you are afraid to raise your hand because you're sitting next to that person? Awkward, right? Just for the moment, it's a little awkward. Well, the question becomes then, in these moments, how do we respond? And this is really what I want to get after this morning is, from a biblical perspective, how do we respond to discouraging seasons and maybe even critical opponents? And that brings us to the story of Nehemiah. It brings us to where he is at in his vision in following God to accomplish this really amazing feat of building this entire wall around the city. We're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 4 this morning. If you want to turn there in your Bible, you can do that. The words will be on the screen as well. But let me catch you up to speed a little bit, because Nehemiah's story is sort of an interesting journey. In fact, he starts off in a city completely different. He's in the capital of Persia. He's in the city of Susa, and he's got this job working for the king. But his real heart is for his people and his homeland and his city, Jerusalem. And he's like 400 miles away from Jerusalem. And he gets this vision to say, I want to go back and I want to rebuild this wall around the city. And so he has to go to the king, who's kind of a difficult guy in and of himself, and kind of work to get sort of this release program. Like, I want to go back. I'm going to have to take some time off of my job. And the king gives it to him. In fact, the king, because of God's kind of working on his heart, is so gracious. He says to Nehemiah, you can actually have all the resources. You can have access to the king's force. Cut down all the lumber that you want to rebuild the gates and rebuild the wall around the city of Jerusalem. And he does it. In fact, he's got travel visas. He can go back safely. And then Nehemiah gets to Jerusalem, and it continues to go well. He shares this vision, he rallies this group of people, and everyone responds. If you were here last week, we read this really challenging chapter called Nehemiah 3, and we looked at all these people, all these wild names that we got to read, and we saw that all of them gathered together, and they used whatever talent God had given them to serve this greater vision, this greater purpose. See, what breaks Nehemiah's heart is he wants to see his people protected again. He wants to see his people in their city able to worship God freely. And this now becomes, everything is going well up to this point, and this becomes the first point where Nehemiah gets some resistance. And you're going to see how he's got to deal with critics outside of God's people, critics from outside, and then what happens is the discouragement that builds in the camp of Israel. You're going to kind of see that play out in this text. And you're going to be introduced to two people, the two critics, Sanballat and Tobiah. And I'll kind of explain how they come into the story as well. So, Nehemiah chapter 4, starting in verse 1. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from the heaps of rubble burned as they are?" That's Sanballat. Now meet the second critic, Tobiah. Tobiah, the Ammonite, who was sitting at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." Now, it doesn't say it in the text, but now Nehemiah, you're reading from his journal, he's going to pray. So here is Nehemiah's prayer. He says, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." Now let's go back to Sanballat and Tobiah. These are two guys, and they're just critics. You could call them Pete and repeat. They're just there to just kind of create drama. They have no purpose other than to kind of get underneath the skin of all the workers, all the Israelites, and to really detract Nehemiah from this great work that we're doing. I mean, Sanballat and Tobiah, they're just turds, right? I mean, they've got like no good purpose in this story. They hate God. They hate the idea of God being worshipped, and they'll do anything to stop Nehemiah from succeeding. They say all sorts of things like, "What are these guys doing? They're just crazy. Like, they really think they're going to rebuild this wall?" And then Tobiah kind of, piles on and says, "Hey, even if they rebuild this, it's not going to last. Like a fox could climb up on that wall and it would just crumble before them." They're actually very powerful people, and a lot of times that's sort of the way criticism comes. It comes from people in power and authority, kind of looking down their noses at people below them. Sanballat would have been a governor of the region right next to Jerusalem. So he's kind of a governor. He's sort of trying to kind of shut things down. He doesn't want any progress around him, and so he's kind of voicing it. And Tobiah is the same thing. He's sort of another leader in the community and just trying to distract them. And I think this gives us really kind of an insight into where maybe criticism comes from. Maybe another way to think about it is we don't face opposition because we're doing something wrong, but because we're doing something right. I would say most of the time, your opposition, your critical voices come because you're doing the right thing. And I'll just tell you this morning, I would much rather be doing something worthy of criticism than doing nothing at all. So if you're here today and you've got lots of critics, they seem to kind of like always have your ear, I want to tell you this morning, be encouraged. You're probably on the right path. You're probably doing the right thing. I'll kind of just be transparent, maybe honest for a moment and say, just as your pastor, I get lots of criticism. And I've learned over the years that, God's voice can come in a variety of different ways. So I'm not above being corrected and being kind of, drawn in the right direction. So I try to listen to everyone. In fact, kind of like be an M&M, right? Like have a thick outer shell and yet a soft, gooey center, right? Like, just kind of be warm and fuzzy towards all people. But I'll get critics and I'll have to, deal with them. And it isn't always like the easiest thing for me to do. In fact, I've noticed in the past year or two, since we've been online, there have been a lot more critics. In fact, it's really easy to be a critic and sort of hide behind a screen. I'll tell you a couple stories. In fact, one has just kind of been an ongoing email that I would get almost every Monday after a sermon from one particular guy. And every sermon, it would be sort of this long list of things that wasn't included, or I didn't exegete the text properly, or how I used a sermon illustration. And I could tell very quickly this was someone that wasn't kind of part of our community. They were at a distance, and they were just sort of sending these little critical emails back and forth. And I kept trying to draw the person in. Hey, I'd love to learn more. Let's maybe sit down. Let's have a cup of coffee. Let's maybe talk about this. I'd love to learn and grow from you. And every time I tried to draw closer, the person would just push further and further away. And I think that becomes kind of the sign of what a critic's real intention is. Not just always online, but even just in person. I've found that there's just kind of more room. There's maybe less tolerance today, even for the things that we say. I was with a group of people. I won't tell you what group it was, but I was with a group, and I just started to kind of respond to someone, and I said the words, out of my mouth came the words, well, I'm a conservative. And I said that, and the person didn't let me finish what I was going to say, and the person sort of jumped on that word and said, whoa, 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 Pastor. Let's not make this political. In fact, aren't you supposed to be neutral? That was the exact words that someone said. And I kind of heard those words, and I said, well, you didn't let me finish. When I said I was a conservative, I was going to say that I'm a conservative theologically. And I think what we live in today is we live in a world that is so politically polarized that you can't even use that word without someone thinking that you mean political undertones in it. And so I thought I would just say this morning that what I mean when I say I'm theologically conservative is that I believe that there is a great God who is sovereign and in control of every action, every movement in our cosmos. And I believe that this God has created humanity in his image. That's the beautiful part of what I get to look out every Sunday and see. I get to see God's humanity, and we represent that humanity as man and as woman. I believe in that we reflect this image of God. And because we reflect this image of God, God's given us a way to live and to promote the family and to promote the covenant of marriage. That's something I believe in very strongly. God has given us life, and we should protect life. We should be about the sanctity of human life and protecting those who can't protect themselves. I believe conservatively that we should be about biblical justice and trying to understand what justice means in our world today. I believe in just this freedom to assemble. And like Nehemiah, I have a heart that people can just be free to worship and be gathered together. And no matter how nicely I say that, I will probably still be criticized. It just kind of comes with the territory of maybe opening your mouth and saying what you believe. I want to say, too, that when it comes to the culture, I believe in being like Paul, that we are to really allow all things for all people so that by all possible means we might save some. That's my heart, that we are people of grace and mercy and that we are not the judge. I would much rather engage in thoughtful dialogue than trying to argue with someone on social media. That's just who I am. That's, love it or hate it, that's who God has made me to be. And I think that's what really matters, is that we stand for what we really truly are. And so when it comes to critics, and if your vision is right, and if the work is good, then the question becomes, how do we respond to critical voices? And I would say the first thing I would offer is we don't respond. Sometimes the best response is a non-response. Now, I can kind of imagine, and I could even maybe feel some of you kind of pushing back and saying, well, Pastor, that kind of seems like a cop-out, right? Like, is that just because you don't want to have, conflict and have dialogue with people? And actually, I think it's the opposite. I think it says something about us if we always feel we have to engage with our critics, right? I don't know about you, but oftentimes my first response is usually not my best response. And so usually the best thing to do, and probably what takes far more control today, is to choose to not respond, or at least to choose to wait. Maybe wait a long time before you respond. But I think it takes more control. And so I just want to give you permission this morning, just as a church. I just want to tell you that if you're facing criticism and you're getting emails or voicemails or tweets or Facebook posts, that whatever you're facing, that you don't have to respond to every critical comment. You don't have to. You can just allow God to answer for you. In fact, that's what Nehemiah does. Nehemiah doesn't respond. Instead, he gives us this alternative. He doesn't let us off the hook, but instead of a non-response, what Nehemiah does is instead he prays. What a great solution. I mean, you ever think about just maybe praying for those people who are critical in your life? Has it even crossed your mind, I could be praying for that person as well? And this is what Nehemiah does. He actually turns this prayer into kind of this moment where he just sort of talks to God. And I'll read you just a part of the prayer again. He says, "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads." It's maybe not the nicest prayer you could offer for someone, but he's praying for these people who are just kind of dogging him. And it's this little prayer. God, you deal with them. God, our vision is right. God, the work is good. And so we're going to keep doing the work. But God, we're asking that you would intercede, that you would deal with these critics. And he gives this little prayer. I'd like to call this prayer sort of this little breath prayer, because it's not more than a few sentences or a few words even. He just kind of says it underneath his breath. And I was thinking this week about how just as a church like today, how easy it would be for all of us to maybe just practice a little bit of breath prayer, right? I mean, just every moment you have an opportunity to breathe. Every moment you have an opportunity to pray. And maybe that just kind of becomes your new focus. Instead of responding so quickly, responding in the flesh, I'm going to reflect on this opportunity to pray for those around me. Maybe you just kind of turn it into a little prayer. I was thinking this year about how God has kind of given me this one word. He's given me this word, patience. And I've kind of turned that into my prayer time and just kind of using that word patience, just to kind of go into meetings and go into times that are difficult and say, God, just give me more patience. God, I need your patience in my home, or maybe in the places that you're taking me to. Maybe your word is different. Maybe you're carrying around lots and lots of stress, and it just feels like this just heavy load, bricks on your back. And maybe your word is release. God, I just need to release all of this tension, all of this stress. And you just kind of make that your breath prayer. Maybe you struggle with just depression, and your breath prayer is just joy. God, give me joy always. Give me strength. Give me mercy. And you just do that over and over throughout your day. But I asked you earlier, let me just ask you again, who's your critic? Who's the person that's most critical of you? Who's that person that just dogs you? Get kind of a picture of them in your mind. They nitpick, they nag, they're constantly on you. Now, do you have a picture of who that person is? All right? That's the person you're supposed to pray for. That person should be the target of your prayers. You keep lifting them up. You keep giving them over to who God is. That's what Nehemiah does. And really the situation continues to go on. In fact, the hits kind of keep rolling. They keep coming at him. And Sanballat and Tobiah, they go back and they kind of form a whole mob of people. They get kind of this coalition of critics. And we read about it picking back up in verse 6. Nehemiah says, "So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, and the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God, and we posted a guard day and night to meet this threat." I love that. Nehemiah says, well, they were critical and they got more people, but we just kept building the wall. We just kept rebuilding the wall. He's not going to let anything stop him. And I think here's what Nehemiah knows. He knows that critics will take your most valuable resource. They will take your time. They will consume all of your time. They will wear you out. They will drain you. They will make you feel so worn out that you want to quit. There was really an interesting story that I just read about that happened kind of earlier this year, and it had to do with a musician. Some of you might have heard this story of the musician Thad Cockrell. He, like most musicians, had a really tough 2020. He released a new album, and no one downloaded it. No one bought his album. No one was streaming it on Spotify. And, of course, in 2020, you couldn't book any shows, so he couldn't get any gigs. He got to the end of 2020, and he just kind of made the decision that it was time to move on from music. And so he called up his record label. He called up his producer and said, I'm done. I'm tapping out. I don't want to do this anymore. And he actually had the intentions of getting a real job. He said that he wanted to be a plumber. And he hung up the phone, had quit the music industry, and then a couple weeks later, he got a call back from his record label, and they said, whoa, we've got a show for you. And he's like, I already told you, I don't want to do any more shows. I'm taking a break. I'm done with the music industry. And he says, no, hear us out on this. It turns out that a famous celebrity was in the hardware store, in the plumbing section. They were looking for some repairs to do around their home, and they heard your song come on the radio. They loved it so much that they tracked us down. They wanted to know who you are because they couldn't stop singing your song. You want to know who that celebrity was? It was Jimmy Fallon. Heard his song, invited him on his show, got to play with the Roots. Now, of course, Thad Cockrell's music is selling like crazy. He's booking shows constantly. And I say all that to say you just never know. And all those critics that you feel around you, you never know who might be advocating for you. So I would say very simply, like Nehemiah, we need to stay the course. We need to stay the course on the vision that God gives us. I think we get so distracted. We'll get an idea and someone will take us off path. But, I'll be honest, I can kind of get distracted all on my own. Like, I don't even need someone else to distract me. I can find my way into plenty of distractions and find that I don't accomplish what I want to. I can do a good job of sort of ruining my own attention span. And I think that's what we need, is we need some boundaries around our vision. I love what Nehemiah says in verse 9. He says, we prayed and we posted a guard, right? We prayed, but then we kind of put up this perimeter of boundary to kind of protect us. We posted a guard around us. And maybe what we need is we need some guardrails around our vision. I was enjoying yesterday, and I decided to go for a run, and I should always listen to my wife. She said, the roads are really icy, Ron. You shouldn't run today. Like go later this afternoon. I'm like, no, I want to get my run in. And so I go for this run, and sure enough, my wife was right. The roads were terrible. There was snow everywhere, and I was being really careful to not slip off the road, and I'm watching for traffic, and I'm coming up, and I'm on the opposite side of the road, and this car turns on Prospect, and it's coming kind of like right towards me. And it starts to kind of cross the center line, and I'm running, and I'm realizing that we're going to meet. And I'm thinking, first thing I thought is, it's probably someone from Bridgeway. It's probably one of you knuckleheads trying to kind of get my attention, give me a little scare, like, ha, pastor. And then I realized it probably wasn't one of you because they kept on coming, and I'm going to get run over. So I'm on the side of the road. I jump into the snowbank. I'm hugging a mailbox at this point. And I look at this guy coming at me. He looks up. And he had his phone in his hands, driving, totally distracted. And it's like, I about punched out early. I about went home really early on a Saturday afternoon. And I just think, man, we live such distracted lives. We need boundaries. Maybe, I don't know what boundaries are for you, but maybe you need some boundaries around just relationships. You need boundaries around the good relationships that kind of keep you on the path and the ones that that seem more to want to take you out. Maybe you need some boundaries around your finances. Like maybe that's where you need to kind of put this perimeter, this guard post around. Maybe it's around just some areas of purity in your life. You just need these guard posts to protect you and to keep you from being taken out. Nehemiah is dealing with this criticism, but he's also got to deal with this discouragement. So kind of finishing up the story in verse 10, it says this. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Also, our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to their work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. So Nehemiah then says, therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. I love this about Nehemiah. This is my favorite part of the entire story. Nehemiah has now watched generation after generation of men who, whenever it got difficult, whenever the people felt this threat, they just decided, it's not worth it to rebuild this wall. And so Nehemiah grabs all these people leading this charge, and he looks them right in the eye, and he says, it's now your turn. It's now your turn to fight for your family. What Nehemiah wants more than anything is for his family, for his church family, to be united, to worship God together. You want to know if someone will really fight? put them beside their family in danger. And they will fight tooth and nail. I want to say to you today as well that when it comes to vision, when it comes to your family, you need to fight for your family. You need to fight for maybe someone in your family that feels like they're constantly under attack, and you need to lift them up. You need to fight for them. You need to come alongside the people around you who are like family, and you say, you know what, I need to be about lifting up your needs. To move past criticism and discouragement, it starts with us. So I want to invite the worship team to come up and to lead us here in this time. And I just want to remind you that it's going to be a fight. If you want to build a God-honoring marriage, it's going to require great effort. It's going to be a battle at times. If your intention is to be faithful to God, to strive for purity and holiness, it's going to feel like a battle at times. If your goal is to set limits for your kids, to protect your family, again, it's going to require that you stay strong in all that you do. And so let's just turn to God now and ask that the God who loves us will fight for us as well. If you would bow your head and pray with me, please. Father God, again, I just thank you so much for this opportunity. I thank you for the opportunity we have to learn from Nehemiah what it means to just deal with criticism and discouragement, God. I want to lift up every person here today, especially those who feel like they're just facing discouragement. They've been discouraged in their job. They've been discouraged in their home. And what they need now, God, is they need just your strength to come welling up inside of them. And so I lift them up to you. I pray for anyone today who feels like they're just facing criticism, lots and lots of critical spirits around them. God, that you would give them the strength to stay the course, to stay with the vision that you've given for them, for their life, because their life is valuable and good. And so, God, we're going to sing to you now because you are the great and awesome God. And I just pray that you would go before us and you would fight our battles and you would lead our way. It's in your name we pray. Amen.